Thank you for that, Mark. My mother would have been very pleased with that introduction, I think. And I'm sorry about rushing in at the last minute, but I just had a quick meeting with the Prime Minister that I just got back. Let me start by thanking the hosts here today, of course, Mark and the Institute for Cultural Diplomacy, most of all, and of course the Slovenian government as well. I think we still have a few Your Excellencies, ministers, and so forth with us, so I acknowledge their presence and all the other distinguished guests, and also lowly representatives of civil society like myself, who happen to be here as well. This is my first time in this country since January of 1990, when I was a backpacker and I passed through this beautiful country in a rickety old train. And I'm conscious of the fact that just a year and a half after I was here, Slovenia had to fight a war of independence. And also I recall that 2 years after that journey across the Balkans, Bosnia was plunged, of course, into a catastrophic war that added to the dictionary of human suffering a new phrase, ethnic cleansing. That war dredged to the surface the absolute worst aspects of the human condition. And it's right that we remember, as we just heard in that very powerful lecture, it's right that we remember what happened during those terrible years of war, and that we contemplate how, as human beings, we can learn from our shared past. So I think it's especially appropriate to be here today in the shadow of that history to discuss the responsibility to protect. So I'll keep my comments hopefully reasonably brief, and I think we're going to be subjected to interrogation later on. If you'll permit me, I want to start by juxtaposing two experiences. A few years ago, I happened to be visiting Rwanda, a country where I've had the honour to work several times since 1994. And by accident, I was visiting a colleague who collects testimony of genocide survivors, and he works from an office that is literally situated right next to the mass grave of those who were killed at the École Technique Officielle. And the name may ring a bell for some people in the room, because on April the 11th, 1994, during the genocide in Rwanda, over 2,000 Rwandans were abandoned by UN peacekeepers who were supposed to be protecting them at that school. And they were all killed. And as they were exhuming the grave, they were moving the bodies to a permanent site. As they were exhuming the grave, and I stood there that day watching skeleton and skeleton come out of these pictures that were shown before, were evocative of that, coming out of those graves. There was one thing that struck me at the time. Two things actually. One was the image of a bright summer dress that belonged to a young woman who had obviously been killed in that massacre. A dress which could have been worn by any of the young women sitting in this room here today, and which was remarkably well preserved despite it being around for that period of time. The other thing was the thought of what did that young woman think as the gates of the school opened, the UN peacekeepers left, and the Interahamwe militias armed with their machetes and rifles came in to start killing people inside the school. And it struck me that probably one of the most powerful thoughts that would run through her head was, where is the world in all of this? Where is the world in our most desperate moment of need? Now, if I could move from Kigali in that dress to a cafe in Benghazi in early last year. I was at a conference on R2P in the Asia Pacific region earlier this year, and I met a number of people there, and afterwards a young man called Jamal came up and introduced himself and told me about how he had been in Benghazi in March 2011 as Gaddafi's troops approached the city. And imagine, if you will, Gaddafi's tanks and troops were on their way to retake the city of Benghazi after protests and riots had forced the security forces out. All evening the screen has been green as a message from Gaddafi is played over and over and over again to everybody who happens to be throughout the entire city of Benghazi. What is that message? The message actually evokes the language of Rwanda. It says, we are coming to clean and cleanse your city of cockroaches and rats. We will go house to house, we will go door to door, and we will cleanse that city. The army is coming tonight. I said, well, obvious question. I said, what was the reaction by people in the cafe to said, oh, it was extraordinary. He said, what do you think it was? People were saying goodbye to one another. Friends were saying goodbye, I don't know if I'll see you tomorrow. Family members who lived in different parts of the city were saying their farewells. But of course the NATO bombing began the next day, and the rest, as they say, is history. The bottom line is we can debate Libya until the end of time, but for people on the ground there, the threat was immediate and was real. And I'll come back to the debate over Libya. But the reason I mention this is because I want to contrast Libya in 2011 to the situation in the 1990s. Because by far the most catastrophic and ignoble decisions of the United Nations in its entire 67-year history were not the result of misplaced action, but of inaction. Rwanda in 1994, where 800,000 died, at least. Srebrenica, which we just heard about in remarkable detail, where about 8,000 died. The Genocide Convention had been in place for almost 50 years, but when faced with the actual reality of genocide in the heart of Europe or in the heart of Africa, the UN could only respond with empty threats and broken promises. And as I've said, I've had the opportunity to work in Rwanda, and to this day I can still recall some of the things that were mentioned by the previous speaker, Mark. The smell of death, the dried blood on the walls, the machete marks. Again, one of the most striking images for me was the machete marks cut into concrete on the floor of churches where people had been hacked to death. But ironically, these failures, Rwanda and Srebrenica, created the moral and the political basis for the emergence of the responsibility to protect, which of course has its origins in the ISIS Commission led by Gareth Evans, the former Foreign Minister of Australia, and Mohammed Sanal, which developed ultimately the concept of the responsibility to protect, which was then unanimously adopted at the 2005 UN World Summit, the largest meeting of heads of state and government ever held, 173 heads of state and government. R2P's core idea is that all governments, of course, have an obligation to protect their citizens from genocide, war crimes, ethnic cleansing, and crimes against humanity. It is primarily a preventive doctrine. However, R2P also acknowledges that we live in an imperfect world, and if the state is manifestly failing, to use the language of the adopted language, to meet its responsibilities, then the international community is obliged to act. It is not a right to intervene, it is a responsibility to protect, and the distinction is not diplomatic artifice. R2P is predicated upon the notion, as was mentioned again by the Honourable Minister this morning, that sovereignty is responsibility. Sovereignty is responsibility. R2P also recognised that the world has changed, and that while the UN was set up to stop conflicts between states, most conflicts are now within national borders. But it's a bitter irony that the walls of national sovereignty, which are designed to, of course, protect small countries from invasion and conquest by more powerful and hostile nations, has become an ideological refuge for a tiny number of governments who still view it essentially as a license to kill. And in this sense, I believe that R2P brought the United Nations back to its founding principles, because the United Nations was established, of course, out of the ashes of the Second World War, and at a time when the world, and Raphael Lemkin in particular, had to invent a whole new word, the word of genocide, to come to terms with the magnitude of the Nazis' murderous campaign against the Jews of Europe. And the horror of 6 million dead compelled somebody like Primo Levi, a survivor, of course, of Auschwitz, to write, and I quote, "It happened, therefore it can happen again. This is the core of what we have to say. It can happen, and it can happen anywhere." The recognition of that essential fact was one of the guiding motivations for the formation of the UN in 1945, and that's why I believe that R2P, the responsibility to protect, is one of the UN's most important contributions to the advancement of human rights and international security, because no human right is more fundamental than the right to live free from the threat of mass atrocity crimes. And in the 7 years since the responsibility to protect was unanimously adopted by the UN, we have made tremendous progress. But the development of R2P has not been without disappointments and setbacks. Libya and Syria have provided R2P's biggest challenges today, although there have also been enormous debates at the UN and beyond regarding responsibility to protect with regard to Darfur, with regard to Sri Lanka, where I believe there is still huge issues of accountability which need to be taken into account, and elsewhere. So let me say a few words about that kind of state of health of R2P at the UN and beyond. I think the reality is apparent that R2P is here to stay. Support for the principle, for its basic elements, the 4 crimes and the 3 pillars, is now just about universal, as evidenced in successive General Assembly debates since 2009. The 4 crimes, of course, being genocide, war crimes, ethnic cleansing, crimes against humanity. And the 3 pillars, as we mentioned again earlier by the Honourable Minister, the primary responsibility of the state to protect its people. Secondly, the responsibility of the international community to assist. And thirdly, coercive measures if the state is manifestly failing or unwilling to uphold its responsibility to protect. Last month, at the opening of the 67th session of the General Assembly, 21 states used this forum as a platform to reaffirm their commitment to the responsibility to protect, and this included a particularly powerful statement by the Prime Minister of Slovenia, His Excellency Janez Janša. Of course, if only we could have more world leaders as committed as he is to this issue. But even last year, when the post-Libya backlash was at its peak, almost 24 states spoke strongly in favour of the responsibility to protect at the 66th opening session of the General Assembly. More than 30 states used their statements as an opportunity to call upon the Syrian government to cease its attacks on civilians and to call for unified international response to that crisis. Only a few statements warned the international community not to intervene in the internal affairs of a sovereign government, a sentiment which was rebuked by Turkey and by others who clearly noted that governments that massacre their population can no longer hide behind 17th century notions of sovereignty. Most interesting of all, from my point of view, the Syrian government did not argue that responsibility to protect did not exist. Rather, it acknowledged it has a responsibility to protect and declared that it was upholding that responsibility. The Syrian Foreign Minister said, and I quote, "Syria has exercised its responsibility to protect its citizens. It acted to guarantee their safety and stability." In my opinion, a monstrous distortion and a lie, but also a remarkable backhanded compliment to the strength of the emerging norm of the responsibility to protect. Institutional capacity to apply the responsibility to protect operationally is also steadily developing, most visibly with the focal points now being established within national governments and regional organisations, an innovation that we have been urging every UN member state to replicate. This initiative, which we're in the Global Centre for the Responsibility to Protect, is a co-organiser with, along with the governments of Australia, Costa Rica, Denmark and Ghana. This initiative asks that states appoint a senior official to coordinate national preventive and protective strategies. These officials will also collaborate through an international network of focal points to enhance efforts to anticipate, to prevent and to respond to mass atrocity crimes. I believe that developing experience shows that the ideal R2P focal point is the sort of government official who is senior enough so that they can not only ring alarm bells in a loud, clear and precise fashion, but they also have the support and the gravitas to be able to mobilise their government to respond to mass atrocities. And this initiative, although it's a very new one, is gaining momentum. Even though governments can be slow and cumbersome, awkward to move, we already have 18 governments that have appointed focal points, and more than 40 states have attended the second meeting of R2P Focal Points Network in New York most recently, and I'm very, very happy to say, since I'm standing where I am, that our most recently appointed R2P focal point is for the government of Slovenia, which we think is a very important step forward. Earlier this year, we also co-hosted with ECOWAS, the major regional organisation in West Africa, a regional forum on R2P. There is real and genuine enthusiasm for the focal points idea as a means of building an architecture for early warning in a region with an unfortunate history of conflict and, in some cases, mass atrocities. Ghana is playing a very key role in that, but also Nigeria, Liberia, Cote d'Ivoire, and other countries in the region. And in fact, I'm heading back to West Africa next month to Cote d'Ivoire to participate in a senior level meeting with ECOWAS states about how to take the next steps in terms of building preventive infrastructure in West Africa. But above all, when we discuss the current health of R2P, we must acknowledge that the responsibility to protect has generated not just rhetoric, but has generated action. It has saved lives, very obviously, last year in Côte d'Ivoire and in Libya. And let me be absolutely clear on this particular point. My organisation lobbied for United Nations Security Council Resolution 1970 and for Resolution 1973. We supported that intervention and we think it saved lives. However, we also feel that NATO stretched the mandate it was given with Resolution 1973 to breaking point. We believe that some countries entrusted with the UN mandate ended up taking sides in a civil war rather than simply limiting themselves to protecting civilians. We've been upfront about those criticisms because we felt that these mistakes were inconsistent with the essence of the responsibility to protect. It's one of the reasons why we've worked so closely with the Brazilian government on the initiative that the Honourable Minister mentioned earlier this morning. But as Gareth Evans, the founding architects of R2P, has argued, if the Security Council had acted as quickly and decisively in 1994 as it did in the face of the Gaddafi regime's assault on Benghazi in 2011, 800,000 men, women and children murdered in Rwanda, or the 8,000 who were killed in Srebrenica might still be alive and with us today. Beyond Libya, we've seen the General Assembly, the Security Council, the Human Rights Council, and regional bodies, most notably the League of Arab States and ECOWAS, support a whole variety of measures to uphold the responsibility to protect in Yemen, in South Sudan, in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and elsewhere. It's an imperfect measure, but if we look at just one measure, between 2005 and 2010, the responsibility to protect was invoked in 3 major Security Council resolutions, one on the LRA and 2 on the protection of civilians in armed conflict. It was invoked in 6 Security Council resolutions in last year alone, and 4 of those were after Libya, including resolutions on Côte d'Ivoire, South Sudan, Yemen, and protection of civilians. In this context, it's interesting to note that while the media focused on United Nations Security Council Resolution 1973, which authorized military intervention in Libya, they hardly noticed that Resolution 2014 concerning Yemen emphasized that government's, and I quote, primary responsibility to protect its populations and then facilitated a meaningful transition away from violence there. It was an inversion situation. R2P, there's only been one R2P resolution of the United Nations Security Council so far this year, but it's featured in all the major human rights resolutions of the Human Rights Council with regards to Syria, and almost every major speech of the High Commissioner for Human Rights and the UN Secretary General on the Syrian crisis. Also in a number of recent UN Security Council presidential statements on the situation in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Just a few weeks ago, we have also seen elections to the Security Council during which 5 new non-permanent members were elected for the 2013-2014 period. For the first time in the history of the United Nations Security Council, a clear and overwhelming majority of that council are open supporters of the responsibility to protect. 10 out of 15 members of the current council, 2/3 of the council. Recent controversies regarding the responsibility to protect have tended to focus upon the use of military force. But running right through all 3 pillars of the responsibility to protect is an absolute commitment to prevention. Prevention of an initial outbreak of a crisis, prevention of its continuation and escalation, and prevention of recurrence. And Pillar 3 itself embraces many less extreme measures, including fact-finding missions, diplomatic persuasion, suspension from international organizations, arms embargoes, targeted sanctions, reference to international criminal tribunals, and to the ICC. And this explains why, despite Syria and Libya, we have an extraordinary degree of international consensus around the core principles of R2P. Nobody argues anymore, I don't think in any serious way, that individual states, as well as the international community, do not have a responsibility to protect people from genocide, war crimes, ethnic cleansing, and crimes against humanity. What we debate is how. how that responsibility should be operationalized or implemented in specific cases. And we particularly don't have consensus in the small minority of extremely tough cases where a state is committing crimes, is supported by powerful allies, and is using and the use of military force enters the debate. Which brings me, appropriately enough, to Syria. Last year, just as Resolution 1973 was passed regarding Libya, nearby Syria erupted, and the reaction of the Syrian security forces was more bloody and unrelenting than anything witnessed in Libya. And there was a glaring disparity in the Security Council's response. Timely and effective in Libya, tardy and underwhelming in Syria. And this posed serious questions regarding the ability of the Council to act in a consistent manner with regard to R2P. Russia and China, of course, vetoed 3 Security Council resolutions that sought to impose sanctions and an arms embargo on the Syrian government. The ostensible justification was that Russia and China were nervous that such UN-authorized measures might eventually lead Syria to becoming, as they said, the next Libya. The veto was therefore also an explicit challenge to the responsibility to protect. I'm a voice from civil society, so I don't have to show the restraint that my more learned and esteemed colleague, Judge Schoenberg, showed earlier today. Because I believe that the ugly truth is that Russia would have vetoed the Syria resolution even if the Libyan intervention had never happened and the responsibility to protect did not exist. There are deep historic ties between Russia and Syria that are about arms, that are about allies, and that are about power, and that are also about challenging, as they see it, the balance of power inside the Security Council and challenging the P3, the UK, the United States, and France. And because the Security Council has been crippled by division, Syria has now degenerated into a proxy civil war in which all sides are committed to a military solution and in which civilians continue to suffer crimes against humanity. But while Syria has presented us with unprecedented challenges, we also have to accept that we can't simply wish away the structure of the Security Council. And so far, the responsibility to protect response to Syria has been curtailed by those vetoes. That doesn't mean nothing has happened. The mission of Kofi Annan was an important but limited Pillar 2 responsibility to protect response. But it's been too little, too late, we obviously have to acknowledge, for the 30,000 Syrians who have died so far. And for the record, neither the Global Centre for the Responsibility to Protect nor any of its key patrons like Kofi Annan or any of our board members like Gareth Evans has at any point advocated a military solution to the Syrian crisis. We believe the balance of consequences argument tips heavily against them. So what can the world do now to prevent even greater horrors? 3 victories from Russia and China have blocked attempts by the UN Security Council to hold, as I said, the Syrian government accountable for its crimes. But those who have opted for a proxy war in Syria and who are now funding and arming either the government or the rebels cannot avoid responsibility for what comes next. Russia and Iran bear primary responsibility as enablers of the Syrian regime as it continues to commit crimes against humanity. They have armed the government with weapons to be used against the Syrian people. Russia has protected Assad's regime from accountability at the Security Council. Both Russia and Iran bear a partial responsibility for what has resulted. That cannot be denied. But the rebels are not without blemish, and the international community needs to do 2 extremely important things. Firstly, those governments who are supporting armed rebels fighting the Syrian government need to impress upon them that their financial, political, or military support is dependent upon strictly adhering to international humanitarian law. Armed groups who support the fracturing of Syria along sectarian or regional lines should not be funded. There should be absolutely no way for rebel groups who target Alawites and other religious minorities for reprisals or commit war crimes. And secondly, the broader international community should publicly pledge to do all it can to hold all perpetrators of mass atrocity crimes, regardless of their allegiance, accountable at the International Criminal Court. It can immediately increase the likelihood of that happening by allocating funds for additional UN-sanctioned human rights monitors on the Syrian border in order to collect evidence and testimony with an eye towards future prosecutions. The real choice in Syria today is not a choice between Alawites or Sunnis, or between Assad and Al-Qaeda, but between action enabling further crimes against humanity to take place and action dedicated to ending impunity for such crimes once and for all. In the midst of all of this debate about Syria and Libya at the United Nations and so forth last November, as was mentioned again by the Minister, Brazil delivered a paper to the UN Secretary General regarding the protection of civilians in armed conflict. I won't go into depth about that, it's been covered this morning, but the core of the Brazilian initiative is an argument for always preferencing prevention over armed intervention, although they accept the need for the latter as an issue of last resort. Since then, the Global Centre that I work for has worked very closely with Minister Patriota and with the Brazilian government in further developing ideas about how to make the responsibility to protect more effective in extreme situations that require a military response. This includes the issue of prudential criteria for the United Nations Security Council for military force mandates in R2P situations. And I think the Brazilians have made a very constructive contribution to the debate about R2P, and they've been very clear that this is about strengthening R2P rather than distracting or diverting from it. They're now a very important part and a very important southern voice in terms of the responsibility to protect. I'll just sum up by way of concluding. I want to say a couple of very quick things. The first and most importantly, we've won the battle of ideas. I think we've absolutely won the battle of ideas. I think within the United Nations now, the debate is how the responsibility to protect should be meaningfully implemented, rather than whether such a responsibility exists. I believe it's true, as others have stated, that nobody wants to go back to the days of the 1990s, of the hopeless dithering over the war in Bosnia, why people died in Srebrenica and other places, or the shameful, complete and abject failure in Rwanda, when the world was at best incapable and at worst completely indifferent to mass atrocities taking place during its watch. So the crucial element, I believe, is to strengthen the politics of non-indifference. But we also have to be fully conscious of the fact that misuse of the responsibility to protect debases the concept. Clarity of purpose, proportionality, and precision remain absolutely essential. The responsibility to protect is not just a concept to be discussed in the abstract. Right now, as has been stated, I think many times today, there are people in Syria, in South Kordofan, in Sudan, in the Kivus in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. There are Rohingya Muslims in Burma and people elsewhere who are continuing to face the reality of mass atrocity crimes. Rwanda and Srebrenica shaped our understanding of mass atrocities in the 1990s and the magnitude of the United Nations' failure to live up to its core promise to protect all human beings from crimes that offend our common humanity. And it will be Syria and Libya that will define how we think about these issues for the next few years. And the lesson, it seems to me, is a very simple one. Our ability to respond adequately is still fundamentally a question of political will. And as the Brazilian initiative shows, R2P, the responsibility to protect, remains the only emerging international norm around which the global north, the global south, the west, and the east can forge consensus for a future agenda for mass atrocity prevention. Despite the highs and the lows of the last 18 months in UN diplomacy and international politics, the responsibility to protect still stands for the end of impunity, injustice, and inaction. Nothing more, and certainly nothing less. Thank you very much.